Sometime in 1604, two clergymen named Thomas H. Senior and Richard Jean stand outside a church in Wiltshire in southern England. Although dressed in holy cloaks, the two men are locked in a bitter argument, trading insults with one another as they spit their retorts in broad daylight. The son of Thomas H. Senior, a 16-year-old boy, watches on as his father's shouting and finger-pointing degrades into a full-blown fistfight. It's quite the scene, watching these two men of God trading blows and thumping it out on the steps of the church. But for the young boy, who is prone to anxiety even at the best of times, this open display of violence is a horrifying sight. And it's not just his son that the father disappoints. As punishment for this outburst of violence, the clergyman is ordered to appear before court and receive his sentence. But instead of sticking around to take his punishment, he ups and leaves, leaving the young boy and his family without their father. It's a transformative event for the young boy, who will in turn go on to write one of the darkest, most compelling accounts of human nature in history, which will forever change our understanding of the question, what are governments for? This young boy's name is, of course, Thomas Hobbes, the author of The Leviathan, a book so shocking and unholy that the Church of England would even try to ban its publication, and Oxford University launched a campaign specifically against what they would call Hobbesian thought. But the work itself remains a staple of any political education, even today. So in this video, we'll follow the life of Hobbes, why his book Leviathan is so shocking, and why it was, really, ahead of its time. Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588. During the day of his birth, England was enthralled in a national panic about the possibility of an invasion from the Spanish Armada. This atmosphere of terror impacted his worldview profoundly. Hobbes would even go on to write that fear and I were born twins. After his father's punch-up at church, Hobbes would then need to follow his own path, receiving an education at Oxford and travelling Europe, even meeting with Galileo and Descartes, massive thinkers at the time who were trying to explain the world through strictly mechanistic terms. Hobbes followed suit, but unlike Galileo and Descartes, who were trying to investigate the physical world, Hobbes was interested in applying this same mechanistic worldview onto his own studies. Hobbes would go on to produce works of moderate success on a number of subjects, including psychology, physics, mathematics, and even translations of ancient classics into English. But he would remain a relatively obscure figure within the intellectual world. However, when the English Civil War broke out between the King and Parliament in 1642, Hobbes was forced to flee to Europe for his own safety, and whilst closely observing events in England, he suddenly found the perfect subject for his writing: political philosophy. See, nearly everywhere in the world today, and then, humans have arranged themselves in societies under a government. This could be a parliament, a republic, a crown, it doesn't really matter. The point is, someone is in charge of making laws, dishing out punishments, collecting taxes, and so on. The question is, what makes this political authority legitimate? If someone comes along and imposes a bunch of rules on you, punishes you when you break them, demands taxes from you, and basically exercises power over you, then there needs to be something that makes that government legitimate. Because if the government is illegitimate, then by God, that opens up a whole tin of worms, both ethical and practical. In other words, people need a reason to organise themselves in society, and that reason needs to be more compelling than just do it or I'll hurt you. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that in today's age, there are a lot of people who think that there's no such thing as a legitimate government, and that the two words are basically opposites. This is of course known as libertarianism, and I hope that any libertarians watching will stay with me, because even if you are libertarian, you kind of owe it to Hobbes, and this video should bring up some interesting dilemmas for you to chew on. Anyway, back to the English Civil War. By 1649, Parliament had won, took control over the country, and then proceeded to have the king publicly executed. This event turned the moral, political, and intellectual landscape of Europe completely on its head, and the murder of a king horrified Hobbes. See, up until this point, there was only one answer about where political legitimacy came from, and it was kind of a combination of the writings of Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher, and some Christian beliefs about the way the world was ordered. Aristotle believed that humans were political creatures by default, and that the point of government was to administer the realm, its laws, customs and policies in order to promote human flourishing. A good state was a state that promoted good behaviour in its citizens. This then got married up with the divine right of kings, which essentially argues that through the institution of monarchy and the line of succession, God had personally selected an individual to become king and rule the kingdom on God's behalf. This meant that once someone wore a crown, they literally became more than human, and their word became law by default. To an extent, you could argue that the English Civil War started because of a profound disagreement about where political power came from. For King Charles, it came from him personally through divine right. But for Parliament, it came from the pre-existing laws and customs of England, which the king was just as bound to follow as anyone else. One side believed that the king made the laws, the other believed that the laws made the king. Hobbes came along and found this conception of power and governance wholly unsatisfying, and in the aftermath of King Charles's execution, he would work non-stop for 18 months to produce a new answer to the question of political authority: the Leviathan. In the book, he starts to lay out his new conception of politics by completely dismantling the Aristotelian view of human nature. Aristotle saw humans as rational, well-behaved social creatures that would naturally arrange themselves into a political system to promote their natural virtue. Hobbes would instead argue that humans are by their very nature paranoid, greedy, violent, and individualistic creatures that would naturally degrade themselves into a state of lawlessness and chaos if left to their own devices. He does this by referring to something called the state of nature, in which he asks us to imagine how the world would look if all governments and law just disappeared overnight. In Hobbes's view, it's a grim place in which every man is suddenly for himself, and even when not directly under attack by others, lives in such a state of suspicion and paranoia that cooperation becomes almost impossible. He argues that in a world without government, there would be no industry, no farming, no navigation, no trade, no buildings, no knowledge, no arts, and no society. And all of this does kind of make sense, because why would you go through the effort and risk of making something like crops or crafts if someone could just knock you over the head with a stone and steal it? He goes on to write that in such a condition without law or government, there would be nothing but continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, it's important to note that when Hobbes uses the term state of nature, he doesn't really mean that this is what things were like before governments. He's not making a historical claim. Instead, he's poking at Aristotle. Whereas Aristotle sees politics, law, and government as the natural way for humans to organise themselves, Hobbes sees politics as unnatural, artificial, and fundamentally a human construct. So when Hobbes tells us about this solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short life in the state of nature, what he really means is that chaos and lawlessness are the natural state of affairs and not the other way around. It might sound a bit pessimistic, but I think Hobbes is actually reminding us to be grateful for what we have. We're fortunate enough to live in a society where we're educated, have access to food, are unlikely to die a violent death, and can appeal to the law when something goes wrong. Hobbes reminds us that there's nothing natural about all of this. It can be taken away in the blink of an eye, just like it was, say, in 1642, when England suddenly burst into civil war and 300,000 people died. Now, you might say that this is a pretty dark account of what we're really like when push comes to shove, but Hobbes continues by reminding us that when we take a journey through unknown lands, we take care to go armed and with good company. When we go to sleep, we lock our doors, and even when we're home, we still lock valuable things away sometimes. And all of this when we know that we have the police to call if anything should go wrong. Hobbes then continues what opinion he has of his fellow subjects when he rides armed, of his fellow citizens when he locks his doors, of his children and servants when he locks his chests? Does he not there as much accuse mankind by his actions as I do by my words? And it's hard to disagree with Hobbes here. Even in a functional and orderly society, we do often struggle to trust one another. How confident would you be of your life or your possessions in a world where there was no police or law to appeal to? I don't think it's a coincidence that in nearly every post-apocalyptic movie, book, game, or TV show, one of the most interesting themes is always how we start to turn on one another once law and order falls apart and we return to the state of nature. So Hobbes argues that the state of nature is, of course, a bad place, and we really don't want to be there, but we're in luck. Hobbes tells us there is a way out with something called a social contract. Basically, and I am simplifying quite a lot here, but basically, since the state of nature is a condition in which nobody can trust another person whatsoever, it's impossible for different parties to cooperate or expect the other to honour a contract or an agreement. The only way that you can escape this state of constant war and strife is for all men to simultaneously agree to hand over their power and liberty to something called a sovereign. So every one of us agrees to give up some of our rights and freedoms, such as the freedom to murder or to steal. And in exchange, the sovereign makes sure that everyone else loses this freedom as well. It makes sense, right? This is basically just an agreement to have laws and for someone to keep them. But so far, all we've essentially done is elect a referee to oversee the affairs of men. It doesn't really feel that impressive or radical. And here's where Hobbes makes things spicy. He says that covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all. In other words, the sovereign cannot just be a kind of arbiter of human affairs, but must be the sole power of the land so that he can hold all subjects in awe with his power. The sovereign has to be all-powerful, because if he isn't, nobody would listen to him and chaos would soon return. It only works if the sovereign has ultimate power over all things. Now you know your neighbour won't bonk you over the head because the sovereign will punish him savagely if he does, and for that exact same reason, you won't go and bonk your neighbour over the head. Huzzah, we have peace. So, Aristotle was arguing that through a virtuous but loose government, safety and security would follow from virtue. But Hobbes turned this view on its head, arguing that before anything else, we need safety, and then we can start talking about virtue. If we take a look again at the frontispiece of the Leviathan, we can start to see his argument visually. Here is the sovereign, made up of hundreds and hundreds of subjects, each of whom has sacrificed some of their freedom in order to be united under him in a state of peace. In the sovereign's right hand, he holds the sword, a symbol of military power and authority, by which he can physically enforce the laws. Nothing crazy there. But then, quite controversially, in the left hand, he holds a crozier, which is the symbol of religious authority. Hobbes wasn't kidding when he meant that the sovereign must have absolute power over all things in order to be able to keep the peace, and that includes religious matters. Now, for the time, this was quite the statement. The English Civil War had started because the sovereign, Charles I, was no longer the only power in the land. After all, Parliament had the strength to challenge him. Not only that, but there were also some pretty bitter religious divides between King Charles and Parliament, and by showing the sovereign with a crozier, Hobbes was showing that this religious division was a luxury of too much freedom, and the result was war. The sovereign needed both the sword and the crozier in his hands, and in his hands alone. To us today, the sovereign sounds a bit like a dictator who can do and say whatever he likes, and we just have to deal with it, because if we ever tried to resist the sovereign or his laws, we wouldn't just be attacking the individual leader, but the entire delicate social fabric that saves us from ourselves. As you can imagine, the parliamentarians, who had, let's not forget, won the Civil War, immediately mistook Hobbes for a royalist who was defending Charles's right to rule on royal grounds. Parliament was completely wrong about this. Hobbes was not a royalist or a particular fan of the king. In fact, he writes that the sovereign doesn't actually need to be a king. It can just be a collection of persons, not unlike a parliament. All that's really important to Hobbes is that whoever or whatever is in charge must be all-powerful in order to prevent the possibility of civil war and a return to the state of nature. I said earlier that Hobbes was inspired by Galileo and Descartes, who were employing a mechanistic, scientific worldview on their respective subjects, and Hobbes is no exception to this either. His appeal to a state of nature and the idea that we can escape it by signing a contract with an artificially empowered sovereign flew directly in the face of the divine right of kings, which was a religious, not a mechanistic view of the world. In Hobbes' worldview, kings were not kings because God had selected them to be so. Kings were just kings because humans needed someone to do the job, and whoever happened to be sitting on the throne does so out of sheer coincidence. There's nothing unique or special or godly about a man wearing a crown. All that's required is that he keeps the peace. It's an awkward and nuanced position for Hobbes to hold. On the one hand, kings must be all-powerful and free to act with impunity in all things, but at the same time, there's nothing special about them. Their power comes from the consent of those ruled, and they're not imbued with any spiritual or godly power. Hobbes actually wrote an earlier treatise called De Cive, in which the frontispiece shows all rulers governing under the direction of heaven. But by the time Leviathan comes out, that's all gone. There's nothing above the sovereign. He's nothing more than an artificial amalgamation of constituent parts in a physical world. All of this made him a royalist in the eyes of Parliament and a heretic in the eyes of the royalists. It would be an understatement to say that Hobbes was an unpopular intellectual figure, and his beliefs would be viciously attacked for the remainder of the century. Hobbes himself would go on to live until the age of 91, which was a staggering achievement by 17th century standards. But live as long as the man might, the work itself lived longer. Despite the controversial reception, the Leviathan is still being discussed in college lecture halls even to this day. So, what are governments for? Thomas Hobbes would argue, they're there to protect us from ourselves.